Hey, everybody, welcome back to the podcast. You're listening to the longest running superhero role playing game on Earth. I'm your host, the Game Master, and today we're talking about the 1980s Supermobile versus its counterpart, the Lex Soar 7, which were both invented for the Superpowers collection by Kenner in 1984. But before we get into it, smash that like button, make sure you're subscribed, ring the bell for notifications, and leave us a comment. We've got an awesome community here, and it's all thanks to you. So thank you so much for being here. With all that said, let's dive in. The prologue to this one takes place when Lex Luthor Sr. flies to Earth from the planet Lexor, where he built a starfighter called the Lex Soar 7. The president at that time is Ronald Reagan, and he's in a parade along with the Boy Scouts of America when the Lex Soar 7 hovers overhead and abducts him using the vehicle's telekinesis power, which we described as a beam of light, like what we see in various movies, like Fire in the Sky. Anyway, so one of the Cub Scouts is actually Superboy in disguise, and his father, Superman, is also here watching the parade in his secret identity as a retired newspaper reporter named Clark Kent Sr. So he slips away in the panic and confusion of the crowd and changes into Superman. He flies after the Lexor 7, but Luthor uses its kryptonite claw to capture and knock out the Man of Steel, and he begins to fly away with him, which brings us to the main plot. Superboy changes into his costume using super speed. Then he uses the communicator in his belt buckle to summon the sleek new 1980s version of the Supermobile, which is immune to things like kryptonite, magic, red sun radiation, etc. So Superboy gets in and is freaked out. So he asks the Supermobile what they should do. And the Supermobile's onboard computer is extremely reminiscent of Kit from Knight Rider. So it says they need to find a way to rescue Superman and the president. Luthor sees that Superboy has summoned the Supermobile, so he flies around for another attack, and we roll initiative. The good guys are faster, so they get to go first. They can see that the Lexor 7 is powering up the two blasters mounted in the nose of the craft. So on the first round, the Supermobile declares active dodge, which means its dexterity goes from 24 to 48, which makes it extremely hard to hit. The trade off is it gets no attacks this round. So the Lexor 7 fires its main weapon and misses. That means that a 37 AP energy blast hits the reflecting pool between the Washington Monument and the Lincoln Memorial. The Supermobile reminds Superboy that collateral damage is a bad thing, and Superboy says he's well aware of that. Then he has the Supermobile chase after the Lexor 7 as round two begins. Since the Supermobile gets to go first, on this round, it uses its telescoping arms. As a brief aside, by the way, when we played this, we actually used the Superpowers toys that Kenner made in the 80s. I still own that Supermobile, and I have always thought it was extremely cool. Anyways, the previous version of the Supermobile from the 70s, which was recently made when they brought back the Superpowers toy line by Todd McFarlane, that 1970s Supermobile had these silver colored metal robot fists. And the in universe reason for that was that the Supermobile was supposed to be able to do anything that Superman could do without having any of his weaknesses. So it could punch someone as hard as pre-crisis Superman, or if someone was falling, those hands could reach out and grab that person. It looks goofy to me, but I've always understood how it is a useful function. But then we get to the 1980s Supermobile, and that toy had no fists. But DC Heroes lists them as something the 80s version can do. And right next to that in the book, they even include an illustration, the sleeker, newer Supermobile. So we decided that it should be able to do it somehow. But the question was how? So we drew inspiration of all things from an Optimus Prime toy that was made in 2005 that was my son's favorite toy when he was little. It was for a TV show called Transformers Cybertron. And when it transformed, its fingers actually became a part of the bumper, and it sort of looked like a grill or a vent of some sort. And as it just so happens, the 1980s Supermobile has a very similar shape in the front. And I believe they refer to that component as its battering ram. And we do see it extend a few feet. And interestingly enough, there is an empty space there as if it were actually two blocky silver hands that are touching each other, almost like their fingertips are touching each other, which would mean that when the battering ram hits someone, that would kind of be like fists punching, you know. Hopefully you can visualize that. Anyway, so we said that those are fists and that they can extend even further and become hands to do things like catch someone when they're falling or punch something or pry apart a pair of kryptonite claws on the underbelly of the Lex Soar 7 that are holding on to Superman. So we roll two 10-sided dice, and it is the Supermobile's dexterity of 24 versus the Lex Soar 7's dexterity of 18. So the heroes need to roll a 7 or better. They roll a 10 and an 8, which is 3 column shifts. Then we look at the Supermobile's strength of 48 versus the Lex Soar 7's strength of 38. And for sure, the Supermobile succeeds. So it pries the claws open and Superman falls out of them. And we decided that was the Supermobile's turn rather than Superboy's turn, since it has artificial intelligence. So since one of the Supermobile's actions is just using flight, and then its dice action was a grapple check to try to pull the claw thing apart, its last automatic action then is just opening its cockpit. So on Superboy's turn, he flies down to where his dad is and catches him. And getting there is an automatic action. Catching his dad, who passed out from exposure to kryptonite, is a dice action. And then on his final automatic action, Superboy flies back with his dad and gets in the Supermobile. On Luthor's turn, he makes a called shot because the Supermobile is out of actions and it can't close the canopy on this round. So Luthor tries to shoot Superman with a 37 AP energy blast, and he rolls to hit, rolling a 2 and a 5, which is a miss. And since we care about collateral damage, we ruled that since the ships were in the air, the shot just kept going through the sky until the curvature of the Earth meant it went off into space harmlessly. One of the Lex Soar 7's automatic actions is flying. So it has one automatic action left. So it uses radio communications to threaten the Supermobile. We decided that if the Supermobile's personality in our game world was inspired by Kit, then surely the Lex Soar 7 should be inspired by Kit's evil counterpart, Car. Anyways, so it's the Supermobile's turn again, It grapples with the cockpit of the Lex Soar 7, rolling double tens, which is as good as it gets. That's perfect. Then a 10 and a 5. So it gets a critical success retrieving the president without hurting him, which was awesome because of all the things you would want to get a critical success while attempting. That's perfect, right? Interestingly enough, stats for the Supermobile can be found on page 71 of the first edition DC Heroes Superman source book. And there it says it, quote unquote, seats 2, which I thought was interesting because if you look at the toy seats 1. Unless you put like one person on the other person's lap, then the toy could seat 2. So we were a bit confused by this, and we wondered if we should ignore the toy and assume that the actual in-game continuity should mean it's more like a bench seat where two people could sit side by side. And then if that's the case, could you put a third person in there on someone's lap or, what's going on? Because now we've got the president, Superman, and Superboy, and ideally they would all stay in the vessel for the duration of the battle. But since we weren't sure, it felt kind of like cheating. So Superboy tells the Supermobile to take Superman and the president to the Fortress of Solitude while he gets out of the vehicle and tries to deal with Lex Luthor himself. So on Superboy's turn, since the Supermobile has the cockpit of the Lex Soar 7 forced open, Superboy flies in and makes a called shot to Lex Luthor's face, which is not protected by his power armor. And it's Superboy's dex of 24 versus Luthor's dex of 20. So Superboy needs to roll a 9 or higher on 2d10, and he rolls a 3 and a 7. So Luthor is knocked out. And then Superboy flies away. And the Lex Soar 7 now has to decide what it wants to do. We figured that Lex Luthor cares about his own life more than anything else. So the Lex Soar 7 was probably programmed to get Lex back to the planet Lexor to seek medical attention as soon as possible. So the Lex Soar 7 shuts its canopy and flies off into space and then goes to warp. The Supermobile, meanwhile, arrives at the Fortress of Solitude, and we realize something. I had always imagined that the Supermobiles, plural, were parked in some sort of a cargo bay somewhere kind of inside the Fortress of Solitude off to the side somewhere. But if it can get in through something akin to a garage door, then that would defeat the whole point of that giant golden key that you famously have to use to be able to get into the Fortress of Solitude, the one that I thought only Superman was strong enough to use. And so when the Supermobile comes and goes, does it have to lift the key? Can it lift the key? Because the Supermobile has a strength of 48. So referring again to the first edition Superman source book, this time on page 74, we see it say that Supergirl can lift the key too, which I thought was interesting because she has a strength of 48 too. Also, the Superman source book contains extensive maps of the Fortress of Solitude, and it doesn't seem to show us a place where the Supermobile would be parked unless it goes in the trophy room, which is this huge main room when you first walk in. It's a room so big that the Titanic is hanging from chains from the ceiling off to the side. And while it would make sense to me in 2024 for the old Supermobiles to be in the trophy room, since a lot of Superman's old equipment is displayed in here like a museum, it struck me as odd if it would be parked in here when it was brand new. But not seeing any alternative, that's what we said happened. So the Supermobile, with its extending arms, actually manages to lift the key and open the huge vault door and fly inside and then set the key against the wall on end, which I've seen in the Superman source book and in the comics and all sorts of stuff. And that's always struck me as like a really precarious way to store an object that weighs 48 APs. It could just fall over and like crush anything ever, but I digress. So the Supermobile basically just lands then on its turn and it opens its cockpit. We also, by the way, said that the supercomputer and the Supermobile are networked together. So as soon as it lands, the supercomputer turns up the artificial sunlight generators that are on the ceiling. So Superman wakes up and is back to full power as soon as possible. And Superboy shows up just a moment later. And the president wakes up too, and he thanks Superboy and his father for rescuing him. And in return, Superman gives the president a tour of the Fortress of Solitude. And then later, the president gives both of them a tour of the White House. And Superboy even gets a photograph of him and president shaking hands. And that brings us to the epilogue. So Lex Luthor Sr. is old. He's been fighting Superman for decades. So he finally decides to just stay on Lex Soar as its ruler, but he starts to build more of these starfighters. So the Lex Soar 8 and the Lex Soar 9 are constructed, and each one has artificial intelligence. And Lex convinces himself that killing Superman with what basically amounts to drone strikes would still, in his mind, count as him killing Superman. You know, he crosses that threshold where he decides it doesn't have to be with his bare hands or whatever. It can be from afar, you know. He's kind of settling a little bit, but it's because he's elderly now. At any rate, so killing him would be really entertaining. And speaking of which, we were really entertained by this adventure. At least I was. When we played this, we used the Superpowers collection for our miniatures, and we used the 80s Supermobile toy to then represent where on the map it was supposed to be. And as for the map itself, because I've mentioned this in a couple of my other videos, where I'll talk about playing with like full-size action figures instead of tiny little miniatures, right? Because most of the time we use hero clicks. On rare occasions, we use action figures. But something I get asked a lot is actually, how big is the map you're using, right? So at my old college, in front of the school's tall library, it's this really big tower that if you're looking down on it from the top, it's actually shaped like a hexagon. So down in front of the library, there's like this modern art statue thing on this, I don't know what you'd call it, like a really wide open brick area, right? But the bricks on the ground, um, each brick is a hexagon. So, so they work incredibly well as an RPG hex map. So like back in the 90s, we used to play GURPS Supers there all the time. And GURPS uses hex maps instead of the maps with squares. Which I kind of miss, you know. Hex maps used to be the thing back in the day, and like nobody uses them anymore. But at any rate, we would play with 90s action figures. Like Toy Biz, I think, had the Marvel license at the time. And whether it was like X-Men, the animated series, or the Spider-Man animated series, or the Fantastic Four animated series, whatever, like, you know, you'd go to KB Toys at the mall back in the day. And I was buying all the superhero action figures I could get my hands on. And then I still had my DC stuff from the 80s. And so we would sit there and we would play games, you know, on those bricks and eat pizza and drink Mountain Dew. And, you know, it was awesome. And especially in the summer, because 99% of the students went home, you know, and then we just had the campus to ourselves for the most part. And I always assumed that sooner or later someone was gonna come along and, like, tell us to leave, but in all my years, that has never happened. Even now, in the summer, I could go back to that university as alumni and play an RPG on those hexagonal bricks, and nobody would care. So that's pretty cool. And back in the day, it was cool because other gamers, when we did it during the school year, like on a weekend or something like that, uh, other people would see what we were doing and get kind of excited by it. They'd ask if they could play. So I would hand them just one of my 3-ring binders full of character sheets and tell them to pick a famous character and have a seat. And as soon as we thought up an excuse for why that character would show up, we'd bring him into the game. So yeah, we love this sort of thing. Hopefully you liked hearing about it. If so, as always, smash like, make sure you're subscribed, ring the bell, and leave a comment. From all of us here at the longest running superhero role playing game on earth, we hope you have a good one, and we'll see you in the next adventure.